like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Waukesha, Waya, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. Welcome. This semester, the University Y is excited to be partnering with the Diversity Ed for the entire Friday Forum and Conversation Cafe Fall 2021 semester-long series, Unpacking Racism, What Are We Carrying? Just some quick announcements. Diversity Ed asks you to join us next Thursday evening on October 14th from 7 to 8 p.m. in the Psychology Building, room 232 for our iJourney workshop entitled Bystander Intervention. The University Y Global Connections is a student program at the Y that supports introspective dialogue and cross-cultural exchange with our partner YMCA in Sierra Leone, West Africa. Applications are due October 18th to be involved this semester, so check out their website or speak to Cynthia for more information. And join us here next week at the same time and place for our Friday Forum and Conversation Cafe with Karen Sims, the founder of the Trauma and Resilience Initiative, for a discussion on mental health.
Hi, everyone. We'll take some time to thank our sponsors and introduce our speaker for today. So thank you to all of our sponsors who have made this series possible this semester: the Student Cultural Programming, the Women and Gender and Global Perspectives Program, the Humanities Research Institute, LGBT Resource Center, the Women's Resources Center, Education Justice Project, Department of Urban and Regional Planning, Office of the Provost, the Center for Global Studies, First Mennonite Church of Champaign-Urbana, Center for Advanced Study, Latina Studies, Illini Hillel, College of Fine and Applied Arts, and more. Today, I'm happy to introduce our incredible speaker, Dr. Sundiata Keita Chajua, who will be presenting Protect Our Vote, the History of African American Voting. Following Dr. Chajua, there will be a few minutes for questions and answers. If you are online, please submit your questions in the chat. And if you are in person, please jot down your questions on the provided paper that is at your seat or table. We will be moving around the room to collect those questions periodically. Dr. Sundiata Keita Chajua is a Black Africana Studies scholar activist who uses historical methodologies and teaches in the Department of African American Studies and History at the University of Illinois. In addition to a PhD in history with a specialization in African American history, he holds an advanced certificate in Black Studies from Northeastern University and an administrative certificate from the National Council for Black Studies. He chaired African American Studies at the University of Missouri from 1991 to 1994, and at the University of Illinois from 2001 to 2008. He authored America's First Black Town, Brooklyn, Illinois, 1830 to 1915, Sankofa Racial Formation and Transformation Toward a Theory of African American History, and has co-edited Race Struggles, Reparations, and Reparatory Justice, Past, Present, and Future, edited by himself and as well as Mary Frances Berry and V.P. Franklin, and is under contract with the University of Illinois Press. He has published scores of articles in leading Black studies, history, and radical journals. Chajua has been president of the National Council for Black Studies, senior editor of the Black Scholar, associate editor of the Journal of African American History, and served as a contributing editor on the editorial boards of the Journal for Black Studies, the Black Scholar, and the Journal of African American Studies. Chajua was recently re-elected to a second three-year term on the Executive Council for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Since September 2015, he has written a bi-weekly op-ed commentary, Real Talk, A Black Perspective, for the News Gazette of Champaign, Illinois. In March of 2021, Chajua launched Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation on the Black Power Media channel. Dr. Chajua is a founding scholar trainer of the Policing in a Multiracial Society program. Started in 2012, this program provides systematic anti-racial bias education and training for police recruits attending the University of Illinois Police Training Institute, and researches the racial attitudes of police and the effectiveness of anti-racist training. Chajua has been engaged with local and national Black Liberation Movement organizations since his teen years. He has been a member of the executive board of the St. Louis Organization for Black Struggle, a member of the National Council of the Black Radical Congress, and chaired its St. Louis chapter, and is currently an organizer for the Malcolm X grassroots movement. And he works with the Ubuntu Project, a Champaign-Urbana Black political initiative. Please help me in giving a warm welcome to our speaker today, Dr. Sundiata Keita Chajua.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the University Y Friday Forum for this opportunity to hold this discussion today. I'm going to provide brief sketches of 4 moments regarding African American access to and exercise and struggle to exercise the right to vote. The first will entail a discussion about enslavement from 1619 to 1865. The second period takes in Reconstruction and part of the second nadir. The second nadir runs from 1877 to into the 1920s, but I'm going to cut it off about 1900. The third period is the moment since the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And of course, the fourth period is the current moment that we are in now. Now, before I do that, I want to put forward 2 propositions. The first is that suppression of the African American people's right to vote, their casting of that vote, that is, making it more difficult for black folk to vote and to have their votes counted, is as old as the United States. And it both reflects and reinforces anti-Black racial oppression. The second proposition is that 2 strategies have traditionally been used to prevent or suppress the African American vote. The first has been naked racial terrorism, the shotgun policy used to overthrow Reconstruction and to prevent Black people from voting before the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, while the second is more subtle, and it's the use of colorblind language, colorblind techniques in a kind of race-neutral language that's used to cover up racist intent. Now, I want to start with an exercise. So if you could turn to the person closest to you form a dyad, and I want you to think about this question. The question is, how many years have a majority of eligible African-American voters been able to cast their vote? How many years have African-Americans, the majority of African-American eligible voters, been able to vote in the United States? So let's take a couple of minutes while you talk about it. The question is, how many years have a majority of African-American voters been able to vote in the United States? In other words, count up the years that Black folks have had, a majority of Black people have had access to the ballot. Okay. Have you guys come to answers yet? Okay, keep your answer. We're going to have that discussion at the end of the presentation. What I want to do now is kind of walk through the history, right? So during enslavement, 1880 to 1860, quasi-free Blacks, and this term quasi-free is a term created by John Hope Franklin, historian, in order to account for the fact that though this group of Africans and African Americans were not enslaved, they did not exercise the full rights of citizenship. So for example, in the state of Illinois, they couldn't vote, couldn't testify in court against a white person, and had to pay school taxes, but could not send their children to public school. So the quasi-free. The quasi-free constituted 8 to 12% of the Black population, and about 60% of them resided in the South, mainly in the Upper South. Now, until the 1820s, several states, North and South, permitted the quasi-free to vote. But as the quasi-free population began to grow and the fear of insurrection, Southern states began to systematically eliminate a host of citizenship rights, including the franchise. A similar pattern occurred in the Northern states, but the impetus there were different. In the North, as states abolished property requirements that had restricted voting rights to the owners of real property, that is to say, real estate, they simultaneously eliminated the quasi-free Black folks' suffrage rights. So that is to say that at the moment in which democracy was being expanded to incorporate the impoverished folk that made up a majority of the United States, at that precise same moment, they moved to eliminate the voting rights of the quasi-free Black folk. So that relationship between democracy and oppression remained dialectic in that sense. One could say that the liberty, the power, the prestige, and the wealth of white Americans was constructed in a dialectical relationship on the unfreedom, powerlessness, and poverty and degradation of Black people. Now, so that by 1860, only in the New England states were the quasi-free permitted to vote on the same basis as white citizens. In the state of New York, they allowed the quasi-free Black folk to vote if they owned $250 worth of property, and that was a requirement that was not imposed on any white citizen. So now the 13th Amendment would abolish slavery on January 31st, 1865. African Americans would be made citizens when the 14th Amendment was enacted on July 9th, 1868, and more than 5 years after emancipation, and a year and 7 months after Black people became citizens, the 15th Amendment was enacted, February 3rd, 1870, and it would grant Black men the right to vote. Now, I walked through those specific dates in order for you to get a sense that rights were being distributed on a kind of installment plan, so that African Americans are granted freedom in 1865, become citizens in 1868, but don't gain the essential right to vote until 1870. Right? Now, we've got to keep in mind the demographics of the South. In 1870, I'm trying to track my time. Okay, good. In 1870, in the South, African Americans constitute a majority in 3 southern states. In South Carolina, they represented nearly 59% of the population. In Mississippi, about 54%, and nearly 51% in Louisiana. They also constituted a near majority in 3 more southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and Georgia. In Florida, nearly 49%. In Alabama, nearly 48%, and more than 46% in Georgia. And they represented between 25% and 41% in 5 other southern states. So the point that we're driving at is that African Americans were a significant voting bloc in the South. And this, along with the need for what we'll call the demand for Black labor, right? The cotton must be produced, explains the type of oppression that would emerge. So initially, Black men were excited to exercise the ballot. In fact, the vote was considered to be family property in Black communities. Even though Black women couldn't vote, they often accompanied their husbands and sons to the polling places, and they laid out their agenda, the things that they wanted these men to vote for. So there was a family vote in that sense, even though Black women did not legally have the right to vote. So initially there's great excitement, but we will see that voting declines due to racial terrorism. The racial terrorism that's inscribed in what's called the First Mississippi Plan or the shotgun policy. The shotgun policy is explained by former Confederate General Martin W. Garrett. He is the one who would articulate the basic outline of the shotgun policy. In an 1876 speech, General Garrett said, South Carolina is a white man's country. Excuse me, South Carolina is a white man's state. In spite of inward majorities, the Democrats are going to rule it. The Edgefield policy, that is the shotgun policy, won the state campaign and it will win the present campaign. That policy is to tell the Negroes and the whites, to tell the Negroes that the whites are again in control of the state. We Democrats do not want their votes. They will vote against us at their peril. We must warn their leaders that the tall puppies will fall first. I, for one, will shoot first Chamberlain, Elliott, Patterson, and such carpetbaggers. And secondly, the miserable native white scallywags. And lastly, the Black leaders in general, in the quote. So Southern Reconstruction governments were effectively overturned between 1873 and 1876, and Reconstruction was officially ended with the 1877 Hayes-Tilden betrayal. The first voting rights case held in the United States was the United States versus Reese, 1876. African-American William Gardner was prevented from voting by two white election officials because he had not paid $1.50 as part of his property qualification. Now, he was unaware of the property qualification, he took it to court, and he filed it on the basis of two laws, two 1870 laws, the 15th Amendment and the Enforcement Act. There would be three enforcement acts passed by the Grant administration. And what the Enforcement Act, sometimes referred to as the Ku Klux Klan Act, they made it illegal to use intimidation, murder, bribery to prevent someone from voting. Right? So in this case, United States versus Reese, SCOTUS ruled, quote, the 15th Amendment does not confer the right of suffrage upon anyone. It prevents the states or the United States, however, from giving preference in this particular to one citizen of the United States over another on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, end quote. Thus, the Supreme Court undercut the 15th Amendment 6 years after its passage. Beginning in Florida in 1885, Southern states rewrote their constitutions to adopt some or all of the following policies: that you must pay a poll tax, and they reinstated the pre-Civil War property qualifications that had characterized the nation. So, if we think about the notion of democracy, until the 1830s, only 5% of the people who resided in the United States were eligible to vote. You had to have property. So think of it this way. Women, which represented 50% of the population, couldn't vote. African Americans, who represented 20% of the population, for the most part, couldn't vote. And unless you owned property, you were denied the right to vote. So they began to reinstate those property qualifications, and then they instituted what was called literacy tests. Now, those three mechanisms, if applied without racial bias, would eliminate most of the Southern white population from voting. So they also passed legislation that came under two categories called grandfather clauses and old soldier clauses. And what these clauses did is that they allowed for anyone who fought in the Civil War for their state, anyone whose father or grandfather voted in the 1860 election to be exempt from poll tax, property qualification, and literacy test, right? So it was a way to prevent the elimination of the impoverished and uneducated white population. Now, in Louisiana, and this is typical, right? In terms of what would happen throughout the South in terms of Black voting patterns. In Louisiana, in 1896, 2 years before the state would pass their disfranchisement amendments, poll tax, property tax, literacy test, 130,300 Black folks voted. 2 years after they passed their disfranchisement amendments in 1898, the Black vote had shrunk to 1,350. This is the pattern across the South. This is the pattern across the South. Now, from Reconstruction times, right, by the time we get to 1900, African Americans have effectively been prevented from voting. They've been eliminated from the voting process. So from then until the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, Black people were denied the most basic democratic human right, the right to participate in the making of the laws that governs one, right? In January and February of 1965, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference mounted massive demonstrations in Selma, Alabama. Officials of the apartheid government arrested some 3,000 people. And on March 7th, 1965, what goes down in history as Bloody Sunday, Alabama state troopers would beat 600 protesters. And with that protest being shown on television, it would pit the conscience of the nation, right? Now, so that vicious assault would help create the conditions and the momentum by which the 1965 Civil Rights Act would be passed. Excuse me, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Now, the Voting Rights Act targeted the most notorious of the so-called colorblind disfranchisement techniques, that is to say, the literacy test. It prohibited states and counties from using discriminatory practices and subjects and subjected those jurisdictions in violation to submit any modification in their voting regulations to the Justice Department for pre-clearance. The impact of the Voting Rights Act was immediate, so that in 1960, across the breadth of the United States, only 20% of African Americans were registered to vote. In 1964, 39%. By 1971, it had risen to 62%. And as of November 2020, it stood at 69%, about 2 percentage points less than that of white Americans. Moreover, in 1964, of all the elected officials in the United States, whether we're talking from dog catcher to president, there were only 104 African Americans elected to public office. And that includes the mayors of all Black towns. Okay? That includes the mayors of all Black towns. Now, by 1965, it's risen to 280, 3,500 by 1975, right? And more than 10,500 by 2020. Now, today, there sits in Congress, right? Let me go through this again. In 1965, there's only 5 African Americans in Congress, a congressperson or a senator. 16 in 1975, but today, as of 2021, there are 57, including 3 senators. In fact, one can make a strong argument that the only quality of life indicator, right? The only statistic that tracks quality of life, it is only in political representation that African Americans have seen quote unquote progress since the late 1960s, right? And all other measures, one will find stagnation or reversal, right? Interestingly, in the last 3 years, life expectancy amongst African Americans, which had shrunk every decade from 1900, in the last 3 years, the gap between white life expectancy and Black life expectancy has begun to expand again, right? So we're living in a moment of sharp reversal, a new nadir. Now, in this moment, conservative Republicans, neoliberals, have worked to reduce and restrict Black political power through a variety of measures. They've engaged in or refused to curtail gerrymandering, voter suppression, gentrification, and mass racialized incarceration. At the core of the right-wing plan to suppress Black voting is the elimination of the Voting Rights Act. In 2013, SCOTUS gutted the Voting Rights Act by nullifying Section 5 of the pre-clearance clause. And we need to be clear, the Voting Rights Act was targeted for nullification from the moment it was passed. Ronald Reagan, who on some polls ranks as the most beloved, the best president of the United States, but consistently ranks in the top 3. Ronald Reagan he launched his presidential campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Any of you ever heard of Philadelphia, Mississippi? He went there for the Nescola State Fair. Philadelphia, Mississippi is famous for one thing. In 1964, it is the place where city deputies murdered James Chaney, Mickey Swerner, and Andrew Goodman. That is the only fame for Philadelphia, Mississippi. So why would a presidential candidate go to such a small place, unbeknown to anyone, to launch the candidate? Because it was there that Ronald Reagan declared that the 1964 Civil Rights Act was a bad piece of legislation, and that the 1965 Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional and should be overturned. So this has been a goal of people like John Roberts from his youth. So ultimately in 2013, they would gut the Civil Rights Act. Now, the Republican strategy of voter suppression is their response to the US changing demographics. It's changing racial demographics. They fear a darkening society and electorate. Contemporary voter suppression is a return to the colorblind tactics of the 1890 Second Mississippi Plan. Today's voter suppression tactics resituate wealth as a determining factor in the voting process. From the empire's inception till the Civil War, land ownership played a role in determining voting rights. The cost associated with state-issued photo IDs and transportation to a reduced number of polling places that are inconveniently located far from Black and brown neighborhoods reinvents the effects of the poll tax and property qualifications. During the 1980s, SCOTUS took the lead in this conservative assault on Black America. In the city of Mobile versus Bowdoin, 1981, the court ruled that the plaintiffs must prove not just discriminatory effect, but they must prove discriminatory intent. That's to say, they must find a smoking gun where a city council, a state legislature actually wrote out, or they're overheard saying, our intent with this legislation is to deprive Black people, brown people, American Indians, Asian Americans of the right to vote. Okay? So they made it harder. Shaw v. Reno, 1993, and Miller v. Johnson, the US Supreme Court began a process of undermining the 15th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act. In Shaw, SCOTUS decided that white conservatives did not have to prove discriminatory effect. In Miller, they would extend the attack onto majority-minority districts. Here, the court ruled that the plaintiffs only had to demonstrate that race was a substantial factor in the redistricting process. The blatant suppression of the Black vote in Florida during the 2000 presidential election provided the model for Republicans. In Florida, Governor Jeb Bush used a variety of means to reduce Blacks' voting potency. The state invoked the Reconstruction era law, an 1868 law that denied people convicted of a felony the right to vote. They also placed state troopers near polling places in African-American communities. The intent was to frighten those people who might have a warrant, who might be concerned that any interaction with the police would not go well for them. They also reduced the number of poll judges, thus lengthening the waiting time to vote. They closed polls early, or they relocated them with little prior notification. Now, that strategy that was so successful in Florida in handing Jeb's brother the presidency would be replicated across states controlled by Republicans. Since January of 2021, the Brennan Center for Justice counts 33 suppression laws passed in 19 states. the most notorious being in Georgia and Texas. The Georgia law reduces the number of ballot boxes, shrinks the window for early voting, and adds additional photo ID requirements, and it allows for officials to overturn county electors if they don't like the outcome, basically, if they don't like the outcome, right? The Texas law severely curtails the vote by mail. In fact, it makes the individual pay the postage to vote by mail, right? It places harsh restrictions and penalties on voter registration drives, and it drastically restricts what was on American Indian reservations. There's so few polling places that the way in which people voted is that one person would gather the ballots and they would drive them to the polling booth. They've outlawed that kind of response. So the right strategy aims to produce what Lou Turner called a corporate coup de grace. Now, the U.S. empire needs a radical transformation, a third reconstruction. And this requires the enactment of both H.R. 4, the John Lewis Act, and S1, the For the People Act. The universalist policies of the For the People Act do not address the suppression tactics that hinder equal access and representation by African, Asian, Latinx, and Indigenous Americans. A progressive strategy requires support for both the John Lewis Act, because it restores the preclearance clause, which is absolutely necessary to nullify the onslaught of anti-democratic laws being passed by Republican-controlled state legislatures. It would reverse the Arizona laws that the Supreme Court ruled valid in Brnovich versus the Democratic National Committee. Whereas the For the People Act addresses questions of campaign financing and election security that the John Lewis Act does not. And importantly, the For the People Act gestures toward undermining capitalist control of the electoral process. However, both are necessary to push the U.S. toward becoming a genuine democracy. We must admit that historically and presently, the United States is an errant democracy, a democracy of the white folk. And even then, it is this errant democracy is deformed by the privileging of wealth in the process. If we are to have a third reconstruction, liberals, progressives, and radicals must band together and not just fight to preserve or recoup rights, but we must go on the offensive and fight to expand democracy beyond electoral politics and push it into the economy, and we must radically transform policing. In conclusion, the stakes are high. The cost of failure is potentially genocide. We must build a coalition across race, ethnicity, nationality, class, gender, sexuality, and generation that connects struggles for electoral democracy, economic equality, and racial justice. It will take all of our combined efforts to defeat a surging American fascism. Thank you. Now what I'd like. I now want us to answer that question. So, how many years have African Americans, a majority of African Americans, been able to vote in the United States? How many years have the majority of eligible African American voters been able to cast their ballot?
So the important word to it, when I hear it, is able to.
The important, no, don't hear it that way. Hear it as eligible. Eligible. How many years? Ten to 15 is what someone says. Okay. Yes. Yeah. A majority being eligible. Thank you. 101, 151. How do you arrive at that number? Okay, let's think about it this way. And we're being generous. Okay, we're being very generous. But African Americans, the majority, get the right to vote. Or I should say, black men get the right to vote in 1870. By 1900, the vote has been eliminated for black folk, for black men, by 1900. Now, in truth, right, those numbers dropped drastically after 1876. So we're being generous. So we're going to say 30 years. Then since 1965 would give us another 56 years. So we're talking 86 years of the 234 years in which this empire has existed. Right? And again, we're being quite generous because if we begin to focus in on any given period since 1865, we're going to find massive ways in which the vote, though people have been legally granted access, is being undermined through various tactics. But still, that's a frightening thought for a society that claims to be a democracy in which one of the largest ethnic groups has literally been deprived for, what, 75% of the nation's history, the right to vote? Okay, I'll just read the questions. What are your thoughts regarding the current push to change voting laws in places like Texas? Obviously, I think Texas is one of the most egregious places in regards to voting rights at this moment. You know how Mississippi has always been the bellwether for what's wrong in the United States, right? So Nina Simone had this song that she put out in 1964 entitled Mississippi Goddamn, right? And that was meant to symbolize that. Today, if Nina Simone was alive, it might be Georgia, goddamn, Texas, goddamn, right? Because those states, along with Arizona, have surpassed Mississippi in voting suppression tactics and those kinds of things. So clearly, we're opposed to what happened in those places. Second question, transportation has been an impediment to voting. Can laws tying voting to public transit access have a significant effect? I would imagine that they could, but I would argue that more important than working around questions of transportation in terms of creating public access to places where they move the polls, prevent them from moving the polls. Tie polling places to population. You know, in Maricopa County, it's the largest county and it has by far the largest number of residents. They have probably the same number of polling places going forward in that county as they will have in these little small rural counties. So the first thing to do is expand access by putting more polling places in the counties where people live. Use population as the basis for those decisions as opposed to some other criteria. But the pointing up of transportation is important because it has more to do with employment and jobs, right? One of the things we know about deindustrialization is that as jobs move first to the suburbs, industry, and then out of the country, that had a tremendous impact on the society. For white American workers, it meant that they were deindustrialized, they lost jobs, and we saw whole cities, right, begin to look as if some giant vampire had come in and sucked the life out of the cities. My hometown of Decatur, Danville, looks literally like some beast came through and ravaged it. And the jobs then get pushed into the suburban regions, right? For African Americans, it wasn't simply a matter of deindustrialization. So the transportation goes further, right? In addition to moving industry, public sector jobs also left cities, right? And moved out. They closed post offices. And if you know anything about the Black middle class, you know that the Black middle class is predominantly employed and the Black people disproportionately are lodged in public sector jobs. A Black student over at the University of Illinois Law School who graduates today in May, 50% of them are likely to end up working for a municipal, state, or federal government. Only 25% of white lawyers will work in lower paying state, municipal, and federal jobs because they'll be employed by the private sector. The private sector does not employ a lot of Black people in management and managerial positions. And so when we talk about this question of transportation, we have to talk about it in terms of its main impacts on employment, so that Black people are locked out of jobs because they can't get to those suburban areas. And many suburban places have laws preventing public bus transportation from cities to come into their community. So that's an impact that we should pay attention to. How is the Biden administration addressing current efforts of voter suppression and recent SCOTUS decisions that gutted the Voting Rights Act? Are their efforts sufficient? I was opposed to Joe Biden for, his history is a history that puts him at the center of most of the problems that we suffer as a society today, and especially Black folk. Joe Biden wrote the 1994 crime bill. He wrote it. Clinton got it passed, but Joe Biden is the author of the mandatory minimum sentences. He's the author of all of those bad things. And while during the campaign, he talked as if he was a changed man. I think that if we're looking at the first 10 months of his administration, it's hard to see actual change. What he says from a liberal point of view sounds pretty good, but Biden's not done much, right? He's not done much. The Democrats have yet to demonstrate that they're willing to fight as hard for what they believe as the Republicans are willing to fight for what they believe. So the John Lewis Act got through the House. It actually squeaked through the House, right? 216 votes to 210. Barely got through the House. The Senate, I mean, you guys know, you're reading the papers, you're following. You know that Christian Sinema and Joe Manchin are not about to vote for the John Lewis Act. But even if the John Lewis Act was to get passed, without passage of the For the People Act, it's not going to have transformative power. It can correct some of the problems in the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, but at the end of the day, as long as you have the Citizens United decision, that money, that, well, literally, isn't it that money is the same as a person? That monies are human beings, yeah. So therefore, I would argue, no. What are your thoughts about mass incarceration and how that impacts African American community? Do you think people that are incarcerated should be allowed to vote? I think people that are incarcerated should be allowed to vote while they're in prison. There's nothing that suggests that one should lose their right to vote. in the state of Vermont, where Bernie Sanders is from, they can. But more importantly, and I want to say this in a very complicated way. And I want to do this story, right? So at the end of the Civil War, cotton production had been drastically reduced. Before the Civil War, cotton represented 57.7% of all U.S. exports. The enslaved population, that nearly 4 million population, was valued at more than all the railroads, all the industry together. Now, if you add in rice to queen sugar, because it's king cotton, queen sugar, rice, tobacco, if you add those other slave-produced products in, 75% of U.S. exports are slave-produced products. So when the Civil War is over, the main demand is to get black folks back to work. That's the big issue. And there's in the minds of white people, north and south, but especially south, and especially the labor and land barons, they believe that black people will only work if they are coerced. So they put in place a harsh regime to force black folks to work, sharecropping, right? Force black people to work. Now, but then, in order to enforce that regime, they create common leases, right? So that you can, if you don't have a labor contract signed on January 10th, they can arrest you as a labor, and then they can force you to work for the state. But that's how the Southern Railroad, the Southern Highways. Now, understand this. The incarceration part of that, that is a response. It's a formidable response to an economic problem. That economic problem is how to force black people to vote, right? Those people who talk about mass incarceration today, they got the what is it? You got the cart in front of the horse. They got it backwards. They got it backwards. But we need to stop listening to those people. The new Jim Crow. Here's what's going on. The question is about the marginalization of black folks, the marginalization of black people from work. As we have seen, right, the rise of technology, de-industrialization, de-militarization in terms of black folks, we see the devastation that happened in the community. That's happening now. Okay. And so with that devastation of the black community, the marginalization of black people from work, the question is, what do we do with these millions of black folks that are not employable from the standpoint of this particular crime? What do we do with it? Do we let them just roam the streets? Are we going to have a society like in Europe that has social welfare programs that takes care of every citizen? No, this is predatory capitalism in this society. So then the solution becomes mass incarceration. No, mass racialized incarceration. Right? Mass racialized incarceration. So then if we don't understand that the incarceration is a response to economic questions, and that we have to attack the economic questions, if you spend all your time on mass incarceration, you got it backwards. Create jobs, slow down the technology, right? Fight for a livable wage, guaranteed income. I've got a student here that I work with, and this student is doing a study in St. Louis, one of my old talking about. They're looking at the relationships of Christian organizations and labor organizations, specifically around the president and the fight for 15. And what they found, I can tell you right now, at least when I was in the state, there were 45 black nationalist organizations in St. Louis. Right? I'm not talking about the liberal or I'm talking about black nationalist organizations, revolutionary organizations. There's at least 25. Only one takes up place in this. The fact that 15 in St. Louis is led by black workers. Right? In the retail sector, led by black workers. But black organizations are not involved. They're focused on mass incarceration, system review boards for police, as opposed to creating a livable wage. The fate of the African American population in this society, you will find there's a reason that they are the 1940s the watershed in African American history. It's called a watershed in African American history because it is that period which black people begin to shrink the gap between us and white people on all those categories, particularly in employment. When you go from 150,000 black people in unions to 1.5 million black unionized workers, then you see suddenly black folks being able to buy homes. Right? We know that home ownership has direct impact on educational success. Right? A direct impact. You can show that you don't home when you eat dinner with your child, right? Grades go up. I mean, it's very, very clear. We can show that it's the rise of a unionized black working class that makes it possible for black people to watch a social movement like the civil rights movement. Go and look at the film. Look at the film of the civil rights movement, and that is not the 2% of black America that constitute immigrants. And so we have to put the labor question first. The other questions create possibility, but we solve the problem at the question of labor. So I hope that's not too long and labor and answer too. That's interesting, right? For that answer. Okay, the last question I see is, can regulating security companies have an impact on policing? I'm not sure what you mean by security. Do you mean the companies that produce, that provide security guards? You mean the companies that provide things like, what is it, Ring and those home security networks? What's meant by that?
And security guards are licensed to include social service training, to have the better support of the police. The police are in favor of that social service training, so people who they do the first contact on an event, especially the security guard. Are they doing something who's also maintenance guy, or are they doing that social service training? It seems to be that and would have an effect in that support in that area. It also be a way of affecting people back to school.
Here's what I'm hearing you say. You're saying that if there were more private security guards, we said security companies and expanding their role, though they're private security, privately owned security companies.
So, ones that are already in place, for example, the Illinois security guard, doubles as a maintenance person.
Is that security guard paid for by public funds, or is that security guard hired as a private individualized security?
That's public funds, but the status of that job position of the private and like, it could be the educational aspect.
Okay, so let me, based on what I'm hearing, I oppose illegal privatization. That's the bane of society. You talk about selling off public goods to capitalists for cheap prices. You talk about deregulation so that those areas are less regulated. So let me continue. The problem with policing is that police, first and foremost, receive very little training. You know that if you want to be a barber, you would get $1,500 of training to get a barber's license. You know how many hours of training you have to get to become a police officer? 580. Okay, so police officers receive a little more than a third of the training that a barber. You see, so that's one problem. Second problem is that the role of police in this society, When Mayor Bushman was elected mayor of Chicago, he hired black police chief. This black police chief, Roy Martin, was in, Jimmy Black, and what is the role of the police in the city of Chicago? And the first black police chief said, it is to protect the property in the middle, protect the property of wealthy village. That's primary. So you got those 2 points. Then you got the third point that police has always been racist. It always has been, and given the policies in which you Champaign, like 7% of all police officers live outside Champaign, but it's not just that they live outside the city of Champaign. It's where they live. Right? The majority live in Muhammad. Muhammad is 98.4% all white. St. Joe is 98.9% all white. Neither have even a 0.5% black population. These people have been socialized in vice versa circles. So this question of police, the first thing we have to do is shrink the size of the police in their country. Let's shrink them down to essential functions. Then, when we get down to that, like this bill that changing roads and putting forward, we don't need more beat cops or car cops or donut parking lot cops on the payroll. If you want to solve crime, you hire detectives. Detectives solve crime. These guys is sit in places where you can't see them, sleep and eat donuts. They're worthless for us. We need to switch the numbers there, percentages between detectives and car cops. Then we got the problem that the police are thoroughly constituted. There's not enough social control of them. The public should be in control. We need a police chief that is subordinate in a very small unit to the head of the division of public safety and nonviolence prevention. There needs to be more people who are employed as social workers, interpreters, and counselors, and fewer people with running around with guns. And those who are running around with guns, they need to be educated, right? Look, I've been training police officers 12 years since the 14-year rights was murdered. And my general observation of all these years working with police officers is first and foremost, they're not very smart. No, I don't mean that. I don't mean that in a natural. It's simply an objective observation. As I compare it to my first year students at the University of Illinois, and I'm not real by them either. But the difference between them and the average police officer is vast. Secondly, police officers reject their deeply conservative. They vote. They're deeply conservative. They reject basic notions. We've had meetings, trying to work with them, and we say something very fundamental, like we say, poverty, like wealth, is inherited generation. And you get all kinds of police officers saying, for it, saying that's not true. What evidence do you have to prove that? If someone will say, this is some things that say, my mother was disowned by her parents, so she didn't get the inherited wealth. So I know what you just said is not true. Now, the fact that somebody can say something like that, something so absurd and so evidence of not understanding broad social factors. Look, we show the murder of 84 police officers. About 14 of them were black, Latinx, and Asian American. And it's that 1 minute and 58-second clip where McDonald is walking and first he leaves for the police, then he veers away, and then this guy pulls up in the car, and the guy jumps out and shoots. And so we show it to the police officers and we say, what happened? Simply describe what you saw. Right? Because if you're a police officer, part of what you do, you observe and you document what you saw. And almost every white police officer, yelling in the group said, he was coming toward Officer Van Dyke. He was within the 21-foot limit. Police have this imagine this mystical idea that if someone is 21 feet from you, that they can get to you and kill you before you can brought it down. That's what they believe. So they say he was 21 feet. And so I said, okay, wait, let's watch it again. So I showed it again. The same thing happened. So then I started asking the questions. And the first question I asked is, well, why did McDonald why was he the only officer who shot? And these officers say, because he was closest and he was the first one to arrive. Now, what actually do you see? He's the last one to arrive, and he's first. Now, so here's what we're confronted with. I was looking at people, we have 60 some white folks in which is right, but he's also sitting behind. And I can tell you that they're not. They saw what they see, and they saw it because they saw through their ideology. They saw through their belief that black people are animals. Now, so you got to have a program to deal with their racism. Then we've got to educate them about basic social science and humanity knowledge. And they don't operate with those things like most of us do. They don't. They're devoid of that basic kind of knowledge. So you got to deal with that. So you got to shrink the police, transform the racial detectives and the street cops. And then you got to shift large sections of their budget, a quarter, a third, 40%, to useful functions, right? Things that actually do have an impact in stopping crime, education, recreational opportunities. You have to make those shifts. And so in terms of security, transform policing. We don't want more private sector guards, because they're only devoted to their employer. They're likely to be more murderous than police officers. So we don't want to go that way. And again, I apologize for the length in explaining it, but some of these things are coming. I work through. I think that was all the questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sandiata. Everyone, next week we will be joined by Karen Sims. We also want to bring to your attention the QR code that is on your sheet, your chair, or your table. We want to get your feedback and let us know a little bit about yourself and your impressions of the lecture in the series today. Thank you for your participation in that. Also, thank you again for joining us in person and online. And thank you to our sponsors that are supporting this semester's series. We hope to see you next week. Thank you.